Thank you everybody for joining us on today's episode of Let's Talk Tuesday. Today our theme is education, and who better to talk about this critical issue that really affects all of us than a recently elected board member to the State Board of Education. Today we have brought special guest Tim Hughes with us today, and he represents Nevada's 1st District on the State Board of Education, and we'll hear a bit from him shortly. My name is Alex Gallegos. I am alongside Tim on the State Board of Education for now, and a lot of you know me from NASC too. And then we also have Aiden. And Aiden, do you want to go ahead and share a bit about yourself as well?
Yeah. Hi guys, I'm Aiden Western. I'm the communications coordinator on the NASC State Board, and I'm also a senior at Liberty High School.
Thank you. And then today we also have Clarissa. Clarissa, you go ahead.
Hi, I am Clarissa Pimentel, and I am the senior body vice president at Veterans Tribute CTA, and I'm also a senior.
Thank you. Thank you to the both of you for joining us today. Now, Tim, we have Tim here with us. So let's go ahead and get started. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey as a public servant. We all go through the education system. How did you find your particular passion for education that made you want to make corrections and improve it for future students?
Yeah, absolutely. And first of all, thanks for having this forum. It's important to get students involved, and I'm looking forward to chatting with you all over the next hour or so. But my name is Tim Hughes. A little bit about myself. So I actually grew up in Las Vegas, went to Clark County schools for my entire K-12 experience, was a graduate of Clark High School, and am a 3rd generation Nevadan. So go back several generations in Nevada. And so, as Alex mentioned, I was recently elected to the State Board of Education to represent District 1, which is sort of right in the heart of Las Vegas. And so education has always sort of been something that's important to me. I didn't always think that education was going to be a pathway sort of for a career in my personal life that I would necessarily focus time on. But it was really my time growing up in our community that inspired me. So as I sort of thought about what are the ways I want to give back to my community? What are some of the sort of the challenges that we face, and where do I think I can make a difference? You can imagine there's a lot of answers to that question. And so I thought through a bunch of those sort of what do I feel like is the contribution I want to make? And I actually was initially planning to go into medicine. So did my undergraduate career at University of Nevada, Reno, and was a pre-med student, took all the science classes, did all the things. And, it's certainly an important profession, and glad we have lots of folks going into that profession. But when I really thought about the challenges that our community faces and what are some of the root causes, I really kept coming back to education. It's sort of one of the more strategic ways you can help a community. And so that is really sort of decided late in my college career, that is the pathway I wanted to take. Became a middle school science teacher. And then later went on to lead a middle school as a principal. And for the past 12 or so years, I've been working in the nonprofit space, really supporting schools and districts around the country. But I'm excited to be able to continue to give back to my own community through my sort of career, as well as through my service on the state board.
Do you think that being a teacher beforehand and being a principal, do you think that kind of gives you more experience and kind of, allows you to know firsthand, like what the teachers need?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, and others may have an opinion about this. You should all feel free to chime in here. So I think that the needs of our schools, the needs of our students certainly change over time, right? And so while a lot of folks in the system are making decisions now where a student at one time, that sort of the conditions that they were, a part of the system have changed since then, right? So I certainly think, though, being close to what's happening in schools is important and certainly informs my opinion on the State Board of Education. At the same time, I have my one perspective, and that is sort of, my opinion, how I'm interpreting things. So I do think sort of having a diversity of ideas and different people from different backgrounds and different careers and professions is also really helpful because there's, when you're sort of in one thing all the time, you can kind of get tunnel vision. And so it's helpful, I think, to hear lots of ideas and perspectives, but certainly, and you all are the greatest source of, like knowing what's going on and what needs to be addressed because you're living it every single day versus, some of the challenges may have been different when I was in high school in Clark County.
Of course, I really like that piece that you said in the beginning that the needs of our students change. And I think really that is resonating with a lot of people now, especially as the COVID-19 pandemic has hit, as education has really, I think, changed. And I think that we're at a crossroads for education in our state as well.
And I think it's great that you actually do mention that, because I'm sure that when you were at school and when you were at our age, you guys had different needs than we do now, with the rise of technology. And of course, with the pandemic, things obviously change as society does. And so I think that's an amazing thing to bring up. But speaking of that, I would like to ask, so what is your vision for public education in Nevada as a recently elected State Board of Education member? Like, what are your goals? Like, what do you see?
Yeah, I mean, I think about this all the time. And again, this is, I think you all have a really important perspective in this. So I'm going to share my vision, but would love to hear how that resonates with you all and what else you might add to that. So for me, it's pretty simple, but also pretty ambitious. So ultimately, I want every kid in the state, regardless of what part of the state they live in, regardless of their background, regardless of the life circumstance they happen to be born into, that our public education system equips them to pursue any future of their choosing. And so what oftentimes we see is a narrow set of choices that students have coming out of the public system based upon their level of preparedness. And so certainly I want folks to be able to pursue whatever it is that brings them joy, that helps them fulfill their full potential, that allows them to support their families, right? Like, all those things are important. But what's really important to me is that no matter what option and what kind of career you want to pursue, that you're equipped and ready to do that. So, I think sometimes you get in these debates about, like, should we want everybody to go to college, or should we want everybody to get into a career track, right? And I think students should ultimately make that decision. They need to be ready to take on any of those options. But would love, what would you all add to that? What thoughts do you guys have if you sort of could say, here's what public education in our state should be about?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's a great point, to make sure that every student has the ability to go and do whatever they want to do. As a high school senior, like, I have a lot of friends who don't really know what their options are, whether that be college or trade school or going to a community college, going into the workforce. And so I really appreciate that that is a main goal of yours. I think that one of the biggest issues, I guess, in education is really the quality of opportunity. And just depending on maybe where you go to school, what your family's income background is, a lot of different factors. So if we can try and make it more equitable, I think that's really important for it.
Yes, for sure. And I totally agree. And, I have a lot of friends who are also seniors, and the question that always comes up is, like, should I go to college? And I think it's not necessarily because they don't want to, like, further their education, but a lot of the times it's, oh, I wouldn't want this amount of debt for the rest of my life, or I don't want to pay this amount of money. And, trying to, like, open up that gap and making sure that if you want to be more educated, having that ability, I think, is so powerful. And I think that is something we should prioritize.
Yeah, and I know from personal experience that throughout my schooling experience that I've been told college is the right option or the logical next step. And I really appreciate the discussions happening now, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic, that has showed people that, maybe college isn't the right step for me, that we're kind of diverging away from that thought and really trying to pursue equality of opportunity for all students and really get them to where they want to be and meeting them where they are. I think as a baseline, public education should really try to create students that are able to be civically engaged. I think that is our baseline and our number one priority, so that we can have students that are able to contribute as members of society.
Yeah, and one of the challenges that I see is oftentimes students are sort of forced into a particular pathway very early on, right? So if you say, what kind of career do you want to do, and you ask that sort of over time, that changes because students sometimes see limiting options the further they get in the system. And so you have to be cautious that it is truly the student's choice and not a choice that the adults in the system have made that has set them on a particular pathway. And that's, I think, where we run into a lot of trouble, because kids then sort of in high school will only think about maybe one pathway because that's either all they've heard about, that's all they've been exposed to, that's all they feel ready to do. And so we want to make sure that, all the options are out there. they feel like they could pursue any of those options. And that's where I feel like we'll really have a strong education system when we reach that goal.
So what is the largest problem facing public school students in the state of Nevada, and what can be done to solve these issues?
Happy to jump into that. Such a big and important question. So, and I think you all actually sort of named this already in your vision. So I think one of the largest problems we face is equity, and not having equitable outcomes or equitable access. And so specifically right now, you can sort of predict like academic outcomes oftentimes based on a bunch of other demographic factors. So someone's socioeconomics, their racial background, what zip code they grow up in, whether they're a multilingual learner, whether they have, learning differences. There's a bunch of sort of ways you could cut the data. And what you'd want to see is something that's more representative of the proportion of each of those groups within our system. But right now that is not the case. And so you sort of look at outcomes, and those are not distributed in the way that you would want them to be based on who our students are. The other big issue sort of related to that, I would say, is access. So I'll speak to District 1 specifically, and pull up my notes here to make sure I get my data correct. So this is sort of 2018 numbers, because as you all know, we've had some data issue and there's lag time with star rating systems and all that goes into that. But in my district in 2018, there was 161 schools. So 27 of those were rated a 1-star school, 60 were rated as a 2-star school, 33 is a 3-star, 13 is a 4-star, 9 were rated as a 5-star, and then 19 for a variety of factors were not rated. So if you think about that, that represents 118,000 students. That's a pretty large number. And there's only, 13 4-star and 9 5-star schools for students to go to that would be able to set them up on a different academic trajectory. And so if you think about, we just don't have enough of those great schools yet, where every kid, their neighborhood school is one of those great schools. And I certainly think every kid deserves that. They should be able to go to a public neighborhood school that's going to offer them that. And that is, we could get into a whole debate about star ratings. I'm sure you'll have a lot of opinions. Certainly is one measure. There are certainly great things happening at all of these schools, great programs, dedicated teachers, people who really care about kids. But when you just look at sort of the raw numbers of what are the academic outcomes and what trajectory are these schools putting kids on, most kids don't have the ability to go to, because of where they're zoned, to one of the schools that are top performing. And so that's going to continue to be an issue. So sort of that equity and access piece, I would say, are some of the biggest challenges. I hope we get into some ideas that you all have of how we solve that. Happy to share some of my thoughts as well, but I'm curious if you all have any other, what are the things would you all name as some of the big challenges we're facing?
I may be biased because I'm sitting on the State Board of Education, so I'm listening in on some of these discussions too. But I think one of the hugest problems that we're facing is the drying up of our educator pipeline, specifically our educators that are homegrown, that come from Nevada and teach communities that they came from, and then also educators that are people of color, and then younger teachers as well. I think we're seeing a lot of teachers grow older, but not necessarily seeing many younger teachers come into the workforce as well. I think representation is a super important part of education, and that, I think kids need to be see themselves reflected somehow in order to best learn. And I think it would just be better for everybody that way. I can only think of one teacher that I had that was a Black woman, and I obviously there were more students that might have benefited from seeing themselves represented in their teachers as well. And then also so that they could become teachers once they see themselves, right? Like you said, I totally agree that equity is super important. And I think that we're creating kind of dangerous self-fulfilling prophecies, which is something that we kind of hear a lot now. And I think language is super important too, so that we don't predestine kids for a certain track based off of those factors that you had talked about, like their family's income, stuff like that.
Yeah, Alex, I'm so glad you brought up the teacher pipeline, because that is certainly one of the, when you think about equity and access, one of the ways we address that is by ensuring that every student has access to a high quality teacher in their classroom at every grade. and that those are diverse teachers representing, sort of their communities, as you stated. And so that is certainly, I think, one of the key solutions we should continue to be focused on as a state, because that certainly should help with both of those. Sorry, Claire, I think you're about to jump in there.
Oh, I just wanted to kind of reiterate with like what Alex was saying and, taking care of our teachers. I know personally, like I have had teachers who kind of had to pay out of pocket in order to buy supplies for their students, and I think that a high quality teacher will produce high quality products. And obviously teachers aren't products or anything, but I do think that taking care of our teachers and our educators, making them happier and making sure they're well taken care of, that will result in, a better system for all of us, and they will tend to be better teachers and to produce better products, which is like the education of our kids and the future students.
Yeah, that's right. It's not just about recruiting and selecting more teachers, although that has to be part of the solution. You're exactly right. You have to think about how are we retain. We have lots of great teachers in our system. How are we retaining them? How are we supporting them so they have opportunities for career growth? There's a lot of support that sort of goes into keeping our teachers as well. So it's important to look at both sides.
Yeah, I think kind of going off of lack of teachers, something that I've seen as a big issue in my school over the past few years is overcrowding. I started my freshman year with about 2,500 students in my school, and we've since grown to over 3,100 in just 4 years. That's a lot of students, a lot of extra students for the same amount of teachers, really, same amount of space. And I think that a huge part of education is really that individualized attention. And I think as public school students, we're often lacking that just because of the sheer size of our school. I have classes that are 40 students that are designed to be like seminar type classes, but with 40 students, that's not possible. My counselor deals with 500 students. And so it's really hard to get that attention because they have to be able to spread themselves so thin. So I think that I'm not 100% sure on solutions. Again, obviously recruiting more teachers, possibly making more schools. I think that is one of the biggest issues I've faced. And so I'd maybe like to hear any of your guys' thoughts on that.
I'm really glad that you brought up class sizes. And I think, Tim, do you want to go ahead and talk about the effects that we can see after class sizes are reduced? And, those are also things that we're talking about currently on the State Board of Education.
Yeah, of course. And it's actually hard to tell. So we have certainly on the state board been looking at some data, and over time the state has focused on class size. And you all may remember, at least in certain elementary grades, there's been a push to reduce class sizes. And exactly for the reason you're saying, how do you make sure that the workload is feasible for a teacher who's trying to give individualized support, reach out and have strong partnerships with families, right? There's the sort of more students you have, there's less dedicated time often, right? When you have large class sizes like you're describing. It is, what I will say though, is there is, I would say, a variety of opinions, and would love to sort of throw a question back to you all in that, if you think about our teacher shortage, we're sometimes facing some not great decisions, right? So we sort of can lower class sizes, and then we are forced to do things like have long-term substitute teachers in those classrooms because we don't actually have the staffing to support lower class sizes. So certainly, increasing the pool of teachers is one solution. But I think you have to be cautious because when you look at the data, there's some correlations, and there's a bunch of studies you can look at that sort of have correlations between class size and achievement and outcomes. But there's other factors besides class size that also matter for those achievement. And so you look at how effective is the teacher in the classroom. You probably have all had teachers who you've had larger class sizes, and you have probably felt better about the outcomes you've achieved than sometimes in places where you might have had a smaller class size, but maybe a class that wasn't set up to sort of meet your learning needs, right? And so there's a bunch of factors we need to look at. It's not just about class size, but certainly that is one factor among the many that can have implications for student outcomes. So super important to look at.
For sure, and I think that speaks to how complex the education system is. Really, there are so many different variables that go into making a really great equitable education. And so I think that if we can try and focus on even just one thing and better that, like that is going to make a difference. So Obviously, there's no way to fix education entirely overnight or with just one solution, because there are so many different other components that go into that.
And personally, as someone who, I went to a middle school with about 2,000 people, and then my current high school has about 800, and there was obviously a very big change. And personally, I do think smaller class sizes are more effective, but I also think kind of having more specialized teachers like help. So for example, I had a teacher who taught biology. However, we needed more computer science teachers. So she became a computer science teacher, and she did a wonderful job. But I think kind of, giving teachers an opportunity to kind of specialize in something. So let's say, if you are a biology teacher and biology is kind of like your passion and all of that, being forced to teach something like chemistry, that can be, while it's the same, it's both science, it's kind of like a different specialty. And so I think allowing teachers to kind of have that growth and having that pathway and allowing them to have access to that, I think it's also very important.
Yeah, in lots of communities, and to sort of link this back to the conversation earlier about retention, there's many districts across the country that have a much more defined pathway for teachers' career growth. And so oftentimes what you find is some of our best teachers, they want to continue to grow and develop, and then with that comes earning higher salaries sometimes. Then you have sort of an option of, I'm going to be in the classroom, or I'm going to become assistant principal or dean or principal. And so we're taking some of our very best educators out of the classroom, directly working with kids. The way some communities look at it is they think about, you can sort of stay in the classroom, but you add additional responsibilities. Maybe you're a master teacher and you're mentoring brand new teachers. And we do some of that here and there. So it's not to say we haven't attempted to, but other districts sometimes will have much more formalized within the teaching profession that you can sort of over many years continue to grow and develop and learn without having to leave the classroom. So I think that would be interesting. One other just quick plug I was going to put in, certainly I appreciate the push. Like, there's not a silver bullet magic solution to any of this. It's really intentional, targeted, long-term focus is going to help us to continue to improve our system. I do think we could do much more around early childhood education, which is a little bit outside of the purview of the state board. It's lots of different agencies and organizations that come together to provide early childhood education options. But when you look at some of the systems across the world, really, that have the best student outcomes, they're all very different. When you look at sort of the top 5 or top 10 systems, top 10 countries, but all of them invest heavily in early childhood education. And so if you think about the amount of resources we spend to sort of catch kids up once they get behind in K-12, one of the smart solutions is to sort of divert some of those funds early on, and you're sort of preventing kids from getting behind in the first place. And I think we have a very low percentage of kids who participate in early childhood education, and that's an area I would love for us to do a lot more in as a state.
Of course, thank you. I'm so glad that we're able to create this space, and I think we're all parts of this big puzzle, and we need to come together. I think that students, especially now, are finding that they can have a say in how their education is handled. And I think a growing number of students are interested in advocacy around education, especially since the pandemic has closed school buildings. There's been a growing number of students interested in civics and advocacy. We often hear frustration from our peers about the state of education in Nevada, particularly in the larger school districts. As student leaders, what can we do to improve public education in Nevada? And what would you tell students that are wanting to make a change, or like you, become a public servant and serve in the capacity that you do?
I love this question because I really think I have a lot of belief in our youth and a lot of belief in our students and in the citizens of Nevada. And I think that you all are really going to help to chart the path forward. And so I think the more engagement we get, the earlier on, that's certainly going to be beneficial to our state. I would say right now, given the pandemic, the thing I'm most worried about is that everybody is so hungry to go back to normal, whatever normal means, right? Like, I want to go out and have social outings again and go to restaurants and do all these things, right? I think we're all craving that, and including in our school setting, right? And I think it's going to be really easy for the adults in our system to make decisions just to go back to business as usual. And I think we've learned a lot from the pandemic about, trying to evolve our education system, trying to innovate, trying to do different things, mostly out of necessity, right? But I think one of the things you all can do immediately right now is, what are the things that have worked for you in sort of schools or teachers or systems who have really tried something different to meet your needs right now. Like, how do we not let the system just go back to the status quo? And again, some things didn't work, so we shouldn't replicate those things that didn't work in the pandemic. I'll give you an example: flexible scheduling. So if you think about a traditional sort of school bell model, right? It's best case scenario that was designed for a different era of workforce. Worst case, it sort of is designed just because that's what we've always done, so that's what we're just going to do. The pandemic is for schools to try different things, like what are different times kids can learn, synchronous and asynchronous. Does that all need to be continuous in one sort of sitting? And so I think like really lifting up as students and using your voices, lifting up the things that worked for you during the pandemic or the models you think that we should continue doing is one of the quickest ways, I think, to really to advocate for improvement efforts. So I would say that's one thing. I would say the second thing is just, continue to learn as much as you can and figure out what it is you're passionate about and what are the things you want to advocate for. And try out some different things, right? There's a lot of worthy causes, a lot of worthy things you could spend your time doing. So, just sort of figure out what that is. I think the thing that when I was a student, I sometimes thought like, is there anything I can really do? Like I'm one person at one school, and maybe it sort of is, sounds overly rosy to think this way, but I really think you all as one student in one place can actually make a huge difference. And just like stepping up and trying to do something and knowing sometimes you'll fail, but you'll be successful in other ways and other times. So that was sort of rambling. So we'd love, you all are experts on what this could look like for you, but I would say immediately really not letting the pressure down off of the adults in the system to actually do something different and use this as a moment to improve. Because hopefully this will be a once in a lifetime situation. But that also means you only get one shot. It's sort of taking the lessons learned and doing something with it versus just reverting back to what we knew.
Yeah, and I think that one thing that I have learned from being in student council is like how much like the student's voice does matter, us three, we're all in student council, and that means we do want to try to make a change. And whether or not someone is in student council, I have noticed that this generation or my peers around me, they have been putting a lot of pressure on adults and this system and trying to challenge it. And I think that's a wonderful thing to kind of notice the flaws in our system and to kind of want to improve them, because that is something that maybe it won't affect us anymore now that we're older, but the future generations. And I think us trying to look over them and trying to improve on something that maybe might not benefit us directly anymore, but something in the future, I think that is a wonderful thing.
Yeah, and I think there's so many stereotypes out there, particularly about high school students. They're apathetic, or they're not invested, or they're like, you hear all the oldsters talking about sort of like what's wrong with this generation, or whatever, and that happens sort of at various points in time. What I find is the exact opposite. I think students are more engaged than ever right now. I think they care more about the issues. I think they're more informed, they're more active. And so I think it's really hopeful. And I think that, the more you can get your friends and your fellow classmates to sort of get engaged, I think that's when we'll really see change. Part of the challenge is like, you see school leadership, you see district leadership come and go every few years. And that's true across the country. That's not just the Nevada challenge, right? But who is always here are the communities and our families and our students. Right. And so when that's where the change comes from, then that's really what's sustainable, and actually seeing long-term change, not just sort of fleeting change that happens to be whoever sort of is in an authority position at the given moment.
I really appreciate you saying that students and youth can have the ability to be really impactful. I think that they're kind of an untapped resource and that they do have a powerful voice that they can use. I think that a way that this question can maybe turned around and worded is how can and why should adults and policymakers engage students and youth in their decisions and policymaking? I think that flipping the script and asking adults to be more proactive about including students is another solution and answer to that question. And I hope that by having these platforms like this where we can talk openly about it and cross that sort of generational barrier, that we'll be able to do that.
Yeah, I mean, one small thing, but I think what you say matters a lot, Alex, in that whenever an issue comes before the state board, that is always a question I have is, whose voice was included, who did you ask, whose perspective did you go out and seek. We'll often look at a lot of data. The state board focuses a lot on accountability and sort of what progress we're making. And so we'll see things like surveys. But when you drill down and say, maybe a parent survey, which parents were actually responded and who's represented in this data set? And what you'll often find is sometimes that's skewed by district, that's sometimes skewed by demographic. And so you're getting sort of just a slice of what people's experience is. And so asking that question of who is at the table, do we feel like that's representative of our community is a question we should all be asking, all of our elected leaders, anybody in a decision-making position.
And I know we touched up on this a little bit already, but while COVID-19 has negatively impacted public education in many ways, it also challenged educators to find solutions to some of the most pressing issues in our classroom. And, we see that a lot. So how do you think COVID-19 will affect the future of our public education? And what do you hope that we take away from it?
Yeah, so I started down this just giving the example of flexible scheduling. So I'll sort of share a few of my ideas and things that I've seen both across the state and across the country, but would really love to hear from you all directly, what are some of the things that worked and that you hope that we continue doing because it has potential to improve outcomes, or maybe because it did in some cases already. So one of the things is methods of instruction. So we've invested a lot of money, Nevada has, a lot of other states have, in technology. Still not perfect. We still have a digital divide, but it's certainly much better in some cases than it was pre-pandemic. So now what are we going to do with that, right? And it's not just only a technology solution, but sort of methods of teaching, platforms you use, what you focus on, right? There's a lot of sort of things have been tried in the pandemic out of necessity, but I think many of which have the potential for long-term use. Flexible learning schedules, as I mentioned, that's something I think we should take a close look at that could improve our systems. One of the things I would say, well, there's a couple other things. One is more intentional partnerships with families, communities, parents. So again, schools will, always try to engage families and want families to be a part of their child's education. Oftentimes, though, that can sometimes be pretty surface level. And during the pandemic, we relied on parents to be additional teachers, right? We relied on community organizations to come in and provide additional wraparound services. And so how do we continue to forge and develop those strong partnerships? Teachers are asked to do a lot. Schools are asked to do a lot. So how do we really take this collective mentality forward? I think, I'd be interested in sort of ideas there. And then two additional things I would say is we've gotten sort of along that, we've gotten more creative about staffing. You see some schools who teachers are dividing up responsibility different, and maybe one grade level teacher records a lesson for everybody in that grade, and then every teacher is doing follow-up. So, sort of more flexible staffing models. You've seen people bring in tutors and bring in college students and sort of other sorts of supports. And so I think that could certainly be helpful. And then the last thing I would say is we've always focused on this, but people now are very hyper-focused on non-academic aspects of the student experience. So social emotional well-being, other health factors, what are the support mechanisms, So I would like to see us continue that focus, because we know that education is multifaceted. Academics are a key part of that, an essential part of that, but there's so much more to the student experience we should be focusing on. And I've seen a bunch more conversation over the past year about those things, and I hope that will continue. But yeah, you all you should chime in. What are some of the things that have worked for you, that haven't worked, that you hope we keep doing, or that we continue to try out, and some of the things we've been forced to do in the pandemic that we might be able to carry forward?
For sure. Yeah. I think that one thing that's been really beneficial to me and a lot of my peers is teachers recording their lessons. I think there's kind of two reasons for this. One, if students had to be absent for, say, an illness or something, they have that resource to go back on instead of just missing the class entirely and then having to catch up. I know that's really something that's been very stressful in-person school. So I think that's really fantastic. Kind of on that same note, going back and watching a lesson again to help kind of get that information into your brain has been really beneficial for me as well. I've had some classes where I've sat through a lecture and I'm like, I have no clue what you're talking about. And so I go back and watch it again, and then I finally get that understanding instead of just having the one opportunity. So that has been something I've really enjoyed through online education, is the ability to go not only watch those sessions if you need to, because you're absent, but also, again, if you need that extra help.
Yeah, and we talked about equity earlier, Aiden. Like, think about the families who, there may be a transportation issue one day, or there's a family health issue that a student needs to help with, right? There's so many things that if you were a student who maybe did not grow up with means or ways to sort of address those, and you had to miss class for that reason, you just missed out, right? And that was it. And that was sort of too bad. And so I think what you're naming is there's a bunch more flexibility in sort of that system and that asynchronous approach.
I think I saw a lot of emphasis on mental health during these times, and I think that has been so important. And I think mental health has been something important with like not just students, but with teenagers in general, like even before this pandemic. And I've heard this phrase before where it's connection over curriculum. And I think that personally, I was able to connect a lot with my teachers more now that I need this sort of support, and I'm very fortunate, but I have very supportive teachers who are more empathetic. And I think this pandemic has brought out a very empathetic side out of everyone. And I think that's something that we need to retain, even as hopefully this pandemic will be over. And I think, I can email a teacher and say, hey, I'm having like a rough day, a rough week, and they'll understand. And that's not something that I'm quite used to in terms of empathy and understanding. And I think understanding that our students have emotional needs, and a lot of the times they're very overshadowed by academics. And I think that's an important thing to note, is that taking care of a student's mental health is part of their health in general, and better mental health equals better performance of the student.
I completely agree with everything that you just said, Clarissa. I hope that out of this we have a newfound appreciation, and it's much needed for school psychologists and everybody that we don't necessarily consider a teacher or staff, but that helps regardless. Janitors, I think, too, or cleanliness workers have. Hopefully coming out of this, we have a new appreciation for them as well, especially because of the situation with COVID and disease and physical wellness on top of emotional wellness too. While it's not a hard policy decision, I think that grace goes a long way, and that we're sort of learning that. And I don't think that we should be making it harder for students to get an education. We should be making it more accessible for them. And if that means that they learn at different times, then so be it. A lot of students have, because of the pandemic, it's a very real possibility that they've had to take up a job on top of learning, and that's really valid. They have to support their family now. And so hopefully we learn that everybody has different needs, everybody is going through something different, and we should be welcoming to that and make it easier for students to learn.
I'm curious what role you guys think virtual instruction should play or could play moving forward. So I know everybody had different experiences with it, but what, like certainly you can record and do things asynchronously and watch it on your own schedule, but what do you all think just about connecting through learning platforms online, and should that play a role, or what role should that play moving forward?
I think it's just that whole theme of like accessibility. Now my school is doing in part in-person learning, and that's wonderful for people who like want to come back, but there's obviously there is a risk that comes with it, and people who don't want to take that risk, they are able to stay at home. My brother, who has special needs, he could have gone back to school, but since he has special needs, our family decided to keep him home. And I think just this theme of like being like schools and like this education, like having bigger and broader access to everyone, and I think that is like so important, and it kind of like levels this playing field. And I think we talked a lot about access and a lot about like equality, and I think that equity is very important. And I think this new age of technology and distance learning, it has a big role to play in it.
Definitely, I agree in saying that a one size fits all model is what we're seeing does not work. And I hope that we find innovation and really have a sort of educational revolution coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic. I think that we're seeing that having your butt sit in a seat in class, does that really equate to learning? And I don't think it does. You know, a lot of students have realized that, you know, maybe before the pandemic they were struggling, but virtual learning has really opened up their possibilities, and they've really been striving during this time. And on the other side, there are students that have dropped their grades possibly or were doing better before, and both are valid. I think that we should consider having both options available to students.
Yeah, that's a great point. If I think about like my experience as a student, although the conditions around us have changed, are not that different than how you all experience school. How I experienced was not that different than how my parents or grandparents experienced school. But you think about the world's a completely different place. The jobs, the workforce has completely different needs, yet we haven't really changed the fundamental model of school. And so I think what you're describing is really like, how do we have a more flexible, adaptable, responsive model to what the current needs are? And not just assume like, well, okay, sitting in a seat in four walls in a classroom, that's the way people learn, because plenty of research which suggests that's not the way people learn. And so we should actually, you know, get serious about making some of those adaptations.
Yeah, I agree. I think there are some people like myself, like I do really well in traditional school. Like that was kind of my thing. And online school has been hard for me, but I know a lot of people that it's been really, really beneficial for them because of, you know, certain outliers, or that's just how they learn better in the comfort of their own home. And so I think that that flexibility is really the common theme that educators and administrators need to focus on and make sure that that is being emphasized for all students.
Totally. Well, thank you so much, Tim. This has been such an enlightening conversation. And like I said earlier, I'm glad that we can have this space for us to talk about these important issues that are, you know, so crucial, especially now. And they all really do affect us. We do have a say in this. We all do have a stake in education. So again, thank you so much for this. And we hope that you know, these conversations will maybe inform people's policy decisions or even decisions in the classroom. So thank you as well to Aiden and Clarissa for being with us today. And we will see you on a next episode of Let's Talk Tuesday.